All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 4 of our competency-based education series. We're very happy to have you here. This session will focus on models and examples of competency-based education with the goal of bringing to life and even showcasing some successful and real-world applications through programs and models across the higher education landscape. We'll have the opportunity to explore these case studies, talk through them, and ask some questions about these as well. And I want to thank and welcome our presenters today, Mary Adams, Ann Eason, and Matt Connell. You'll see some resources in the chat that you have available and accessible during the session, and those will be available as part of our resource archive after the session as we compile resources as well. So thanks so much for being here. And I'll turn it over to our presenters to go ahead and get started.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rusty. Good morning, all. For those that don't know me, my name is Matt Connell, and I'm the director of the Instructional Design Center here at EKU. And I have my colleagues with me today, instructional designers Mary Adams and Ann Eason. And this is the fourth session that we have offered in our competency-based education series, 4 out of 5. So we're getting towards the end. As we move through the presentation today, we want this to be interactive. We want to make sure we are responding to your questions and make sure that we have any questions you might have. We want to get those answered. So please use the chat as you think of something, and we will try to stop and get those answered for you. This is, of course, the fourth session. Next session we'll talk about later on, but that'll be next week, focusing on a faculty perspective of CBE and what that means. And so with that, we will do kind of a quick recap of each of our sessions, and I'll turn it over to Mary.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, welcome to everyone. For those of you, I do see several familiar faces that were with us for previous sessions. So we thought before we jumped into some models and examples of what we've seen work well with CBE, we would do a short recap of what we've discussed thus far to get us all on the same page before we dive into those case studies that Rusty was talking about. So session 1 recap, that was really a higher level conversation on the why CBE and why now. Why is EKU entering this conversation? Why are we entertaining the idea of offering competency-based education for our students here in our programs? And the biggest thing is remembering that CBE is one answer to several challenges that we know higher education is facing. Being in education, we know it's always do more with less. And so as these challenges continue to be something EKU faces, CBE is not a replacement to things that we're currently doing, it's an addition. And so it can be one answer to things like alignment and transparency. Are we teaching our students? Are we instructing them what we say we are? So when they leave us day one on the job, are they ready to go? And as that workforce, the needs change, CBE can really help make sure that we are in alignment to the needs and we're transparent about what we're offering to students here in our programs. As the student population landscape continues to change, we know we have a lot of non-traditional students. We have students that want more flexibility, that maybe they want to get to the workplace quicker, or they're coming back after several years already working. And so CBE can help address that challenge as well. And then that conversation of, does seat time, 3 hours in a traditional course, does that equal capability? And we know that there is a little bit of tension there, that may not always be the case for a variety of reasons, but CBE can address that because it's intentionally designed to say, yes, what we say students will do, they'll do, and they'll do that well. We also discussed the fact that CBE didn't come out of left field. It's not some fad, it's not some new wave thing, but it's been here for several years. Several places have already implemented CBE and are doing so successfully. So EKU can look at that, explore what's worked in places that are similar to our size and location. It's rooted in best practices, backwards design, mastery, authentic assessment, assessment for and of learning. It's grounded in all of those things that we know already equals good teaching and that we know is already happening here at EKU. So it won't be a whole new wave of learning, if you will. And lastly, that it is a course modality. We talked about that. And we kind of did some myth busting in that first session that a lot of times people think CBE means a flexible online course. And while it does have flexible components to it, and while many CBE courses are offered online, those aren't always synonymous. CBE is a separate modality. It can be offered in person, it can be offered online, but really it's centered on how students interact with your content, how they move through your course. That's the separation factor. But that good teaching takes place in all three of those circles in the Venn diagram. So that was session one. Again, a high level of why CBE and why now here at EKU. And so I'm now going to turn it over to Anne to talk about what we talked about in session two.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary. So for those of you who didn't join us for session two, we really focused on what CBE means for us at EKU. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more today as we look at specific models and really comparing a CBE style course to a traditional course when it comes to the design, the implementation, and just kind of the way that both your students and yourself would interact with that course. So CBE, just like Mary mentioned, is not just a fad that we're jumping on here at EKU. It is one possible solution. It's an answer to a lot of questions, but we're really approaching this with a strategic implementation and kind of just starting those conversations here within these sessions, making sure that we have a clear foundation of what CBE style course is, what that means, how the roles may shift for both your students and yourself, and just kind of like the best way to implement that. It does give us an opportunity as a university to reach more students and just offer more to our students. So just like Mary said, it's just another answer, another possible solution, not the best or the only answer. And part of kind of defining CBE at EKU, we really want to focus on some shared language, some common terms that we use with these courses that really set them apart from a more traditional course. And the first one being competencies. So in competency-based education, the competencies are really what the entire course centers around. And these are the skills that your students need when they leave your course to be successful in their field. This is another reason why it's really recommended that developing a CBE style course starts at the program level to make sure that everything is consistent. Students are supported where and when and how they're needed across that entire program, whatever that looks like, and that everything is clearly defined and aligned with the skills that they're going to need. The other term that's a little bit different are the learning outcomes. So in a more traditional course, these might focus a little bit more on content knowledge, whereas in a CBE style course, these are really skill-based. We want to be able to see what our students can do when they leave that course, and we want them to have mastery of those skills when they leave the course. Which brings me to the last term, which is mastery. So we want our students the goal with CBE is that our students are able to demonstrate that they've mastered the competency. They've mastered the skill that they need to be successful. And that could look a variety of different ways depending on the course and the assessment and the assignment and the competency. But again, another reason why it's really important to zoom out and focus at the high level program, the higher level, like with a program development, to make sure that there is a clear definition of what mastery looks like for students. That might look very different depending on the field, again, and depending on the competency. So our working definition of what CBE is at EKU is it is a student-centered mastery approach to course design. So we are supporting our students when and where and how they need it. And it is all aligned with those competencies, those skills that they need to be successful. Students progress through these courses by demonstrating mastery of specific competencies, what they can do rather than just what they know, or earning a set amount of points. These courses, just like any good course design, are intentionally structured through the backwards design process. CBE does kind of lend itself more to supporting self-management, but it's still important to have really transparent expectations, consistent evaluation that is aligned directly to the course competencies at the program level and at the course level too. CBE is not unstructured. Students might have a little bit more freedom and flexibility with when and how they work through the material, but there's still a clear structure for what they need to do because they're working to demonstrate mastery. Now their pathway, their way of doing that might be different depending on the knowledge that they're bringing in, but it is still an intentional structure to the course and to the course design. It's not necessarily easier or have a reduced amount of rigor. Again, these courses are directly aligned to the skills students are going to need when they enter the field. So depending on how much background knowledge they have, it could seem a little bit more challenging because there's more for them to make up depending on what they're coming in with. It's also not disconnected from an academic term. Here at EKU, our CBE courses are going to run within the set semester. So there is a term limitation on them. And just like Mary mentioned as well, CBE courses are not only online or asynchronous, they could be face-to-face. They could be synchronous courses online, again, depending on what the course is. So a couple of key differences with CBE and more traditional courses are the progression. Just like I mentioned before, in a traditional course, that's usually driven by a week-to-week progression or the semester calendar. Students might move through one or two modules per week, kind of just depending on the setup of the course. Your course could be totally open for students to move through, but there's a set due date and there's a set end date. With CBE, students progress through the course and through the content when they have demonstrated mastery. That might take a week, that might take a day, that might take a month, depending on the course and the student and the competency. But they don't move past that module just because a week has passed, or they don't move past that skill just because a set amount of time has passed. It is only when they are able to demonstrate mastery. The next big difference is grades. In a traditional course, students usually are graded on points, whether it's weighted totals or just total points that they earn in the course. With CBE, again, it's based on mastery. They don't earn credit or anything like that until that they have demonstrated that they have hit the mastery threshold. That could look different depending on the course and the competency and the assignment. It could be an 80% threshold. It could be a 100% threshold, which is another reason why it's so important to have those clearly defined competencies at the program level before anything else can take place. The objectives are also a little bit different from a traditional course moving to a CBE style course. depending on the course, usually it's a little bit more content heavy, or there's a knowledge component that is being assessed. In a traditional course in CBE, it's all based on the skills. So the background knowledge or the knowledge is still there. That's still a fundamental part of students being able to execute those skills, but they're being evaluated on the skills rather than only knowledge recall, which is why assessments, even a really great authentic assessment in a traditional style course, might be assessing students on more than just the set target skill or competency, which is what we're measuring in CBE.
All right. And then our last session, session 3, talked about the individual frameworks or pillars around this concept of competency-based education. Each of these have been sprinkled throughout various presentations, which we talked about or recapped here just a few minutes ago. But the learning design or architecture or mapping of the program is important, or the what. We then talked about the assessment. Again, that benchmark, is it 80%? Is it 100%? How is that defined for you and in your program? While it certainly can be specific to the individual course, we also want to look at a programmatic review of assessment to make sure that it's consistent and aligns with your content. Again, as content experts, you determine what that assessment looks like and what is mastery and what is not mastery. Our support will help design those assessments in the course. The credentialing, the value, again, that transparency that Mary talked about earlier. Why are we doing this? Do we have, is there some prior knowledge or other knowledge that a participant or student might come to us with? And we could also, students could potentially get through a program quicker because they have some prior knowledge. For someone that has less prior knowledge, it may certainly take a little bit longer. And then there are some operational, regulatory compliance type concerns as well. As I think Anne mentioned a minute ago about putting things in terms. If you think about true CBE, what CBE is defined as, it would not be in a term. However, of course, we know there's some regulatory, financial aid, Department of Ed, rules and compliance mechanisms that we also have to, of course, comply with. So all of those together make up that regulatory piece. So again, each of those were sprinkled throughout the different presentations and our considerations as you move forward.
Matt, we had a good question pop up in the chat that has to do with pacing, since that was your fourth one that you just discussed with compliance, with regulatory. Nadeem asks, his persistent question is, if it's not time bound, yet we have to have that compliance factor of a 7 or 14-week term, what happens with students when they don't complete the course? They don't show mastery in that time frame. Do they have to wait until the next time, or is it partial grade or an F? The concern about being a recipe for failure with that time-bound constraint. And this is for experienced professionals who will complete everything within the term. So that's and all that.
That's an excellent question. And Nadeem, that is one of the challenges with CBE is this very thing. In a traditional CBE environment, you're not going to have a time-bound situations when the students demonstrate mastery. Now, that doesn't mean we give them a blank calendar and say, whenever you want to do it. You certainly can put some pacing in that and say, here are some benchmarks or some milestones to meet during this term. Because of the compliance piece of fitting everything into a term, I would basically say that in this situation, in what I'm reading in your comment, is that you would treat it as a traditional course. The expectation is to students that during these 7, and I would probably say 14 weeks, again, to give them as much time as possible. In these 14 weeks, you have to show mastery at whatever that level is in each of these competencies. If you do, we'll say that's an A. Again, that would be a programmatic decision. If you don't, that would be an F. That will probably be the best approach to most programs. Again, I don't want to give concrete examples because it's really going to be determined by your individual program. I would love to see that kind of loosen up, but again, we need to fit that into some regulatory and compliance guardrails. So Nadeem, I hope that answers that question. If not, certainly stick a follow-up in there as well. Perfect. Perfect.
I would say also it's really important with like the marketing piece and the programs that we've seen kind of implement this. We definitely have a what is CBE? Is this course a good fit for you for students? So they recognize that maybe in a traditional course, the instructor kind of leads you along. Students have a lot of responsibility and a lot of discipline required in a CBE course. So I think that education piece is really important when students decide to enroll in a CBE course.
And I do want to piggyback off what Mary just said, because I completely agree, and I probably should have mentioned this. I did in our last presentation. CBE may not be the best fit for every program, and certainly not for every student. It does require a significant level of engagement and involvement by both the student and the faculty. So I would say it's not a good fit for everybody, but it could be a very good fit for students that are very motivated. I don't want to classify groups of students, but I would say more non-traditional adult learners probably would do better in an environment like this. It's not to say we wouldn't have a traditional freshman that couldn't do it, but it would tend to be more self-motivating to know what, hey, I'm gonna get in, I'm gonna get this done, I'm gonna move on, which tends to look at working professionals, adult learners, that sort of thing. So that's what we generally recommend, but that's not a hard fast rule by any means. So where are we moving today? We did kind of a quick recap of where we have come from so far, and Mary and Ann are going to look at some concrete examples. We've talked really high level about frameworks and ideas and things, but now we're going to look at what does this actually look like in the LMS, in our Canvas environment. We're going to look at kind of some backward design from some program models, some alignment pieces, which again is equally important. When you think of CBE, it's really important to start at that program level, start at that high level, then start to work your way down into the course and into the individual modules and material that you're going to be presenting on. And then what does that assessment look like as well? How are they proving it? How are they demonstrating mastery? And then we have some suggestions and ideas for redesigning that feedback loop, and again, doing that with intentionality. So with that, I will popcorn it over to Mary and Ann. See what I did there?
Yeah, I loved it. So over the past year, EKU, well, we've kind of called it like a soft launch for CBE. We've had some faculty members be willing to be our guinea pigs and pilot this. And again, it wasn't necessarily a program approach. We did have this in individual courses. So what we've decided today to show you the case study component is, first off, we want to thank all the folks that participated in that soft launch and have been willing to redesign their course, see what works, see what doesn't work, and again, educate students on, is this a good fit for them as well? So first off, just say that out loud. Thanks to all of the faculty that have partnered with us to do that. And so we took all of those conversations, all of that learning, what's worked, what hasn't worked. And Ann and I have tried to capture that in a LMS shell to show you all today. And really also want to focus on, if we show you a concrete example, for instance, our course is going to be designed with maybe pathways. That does not mean that a CBE course has to have it designed that way. I think the goofy thing I said in session 1 was there's a million ways to skin a CBE. So just kind of keep that in mind, that we want to show you these concrete examples so you can have a nice visual of what it looks like in the Canvas shell. But just like you can set up a rubric a ton of different ways in a traditional course, just have that same philosophy here when we show you these CBE examples. And again, feel free to ask questions in the chat, interrupt us as we're showing things, we want you to see kind of what it can look like using Canvas to run the course. So Anne introduced us to the idea of this popcorn course. And so What's Popping 101 is going to be our lab class that we're going to highlight and show. And again, taking all of that conversation, what we've learned here at EKU and how this looks in Canvas. Also kind of thinking, zooming out what we've seen work in higher education nationwide. And we're going to kind of use that conversation to show you how we've set up this fake snippet of a course. And again, ask questions if you see something that doesn't make sense or what it might look like for your program as you're envisioning this here for you here on campus. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Anne's going to pull up our shell and kind of navigate us through that. And so I will stop sharing is what I said I was going to do and let Anne share her screen. Okay, so Anne's pulling up our Canvas shell, and I'm going to pretend to be the faculty member, and I'm going to talk about my program, decided to pursue this. We strategically decided to interact with CBE. But first, prior to that, I offered What's Popping 101 in an asynchronous environment. So this should look familiar to you. This is our Canvas shell. So if Anne pull up our course map there, and we'll just kind of reorient ourselves to What's Popping 101. And so my program, I can't think of a clever name for our program, popcorn program, culinary popping. We decided that these were our student learning outcomes for this course. You can see that we found that foundational knowledge in the history of microwave popcorn was important for students to have, so I want them to be able to discuss that history. And we do have a little bit of demonstration involved here. I want them to be able to discuss and demonstrate safety measures. And then ultimately, the last student learning outcome is to be able to cook a bag of microwave popcorn. So we see that skill-based show at the end of my student learning outcomes. This course is designed with 4 modules. That should look familiar to you if you've done a course map before. Everything's aligned. It all looks nice and pretty. You can see I have those first module being the history, the second module being safety, and ending with the independent cooking. And then also I've decided to set up this course with 25% of the course, the grade for students is the final, and it's traditional average course. So mastery in this asynchronous course, even though we don't use that language in my asynchronous course, is basically a passing grade because it's going to be accumulation of those assessments. And so a lot of this past year with the conversations we've had with faculty were this exact situation, an asynchronous course that we looked at and said, okay, now let's shift it over to CBE. So first off, you can see module 1 in the asynchronous was the history of popcorn. I have students watch a documentary on Orville Redenbacher. Then we do a discussion board. Do they do butter versus salt for their popcorn to kind of engage them and get some peer interaction? I have them do an interactive timeline, and then we take a quiz on that history. So that's what Module 1 looks like. Module 2 was safety. Again, I have them watch some good supplemental videos that show safety and how to use a microwave. If you'll click on that virtual lab, and we'll show them that.
And one quick note before we
Sorry.
look at, no, you're good. A couple more details about the assignments and assessments. This course, even though it's online and asynchronous, right now it's set up so that students can access any of the modules at any time. So even though Mary set this up as the instructor, that each module would last a week, if students finish early, they can go on to the next one. So they do have flexibility there, but there are still due dates, and it still is kind of bound by the semester. So just wanted to.
Yes. So I wanted it to be flexible. That helps me with grading. That makes things a little easy to navigate. This is my virtual lab that I found and set up. So they're actually going to use this microwave online. I can assess for safety. For this virtual lab, I have them do a video recording of them using this virtual lab, a screen share using Canvas Studio. I'm going to see how they interact with this virtual microwave, and if, how many safety procedures I see, and I'm able to assess with them. And let's scroll down there and highlight the rubric on this one. So I've got it weighted at 30 points. For this traditional assessment, you can see I give 10 points for actually doing the lab, completing it, and using the lab correctly, the simulator. And then 10 points for content knowledge. Did they demonstrate their knowledge of safety appropriately here? Did they have 5 mistakes or less, or something along those lines when safety? And then because I do want them to be prepared for the real world, professionalism matters to me. So I've weighted, did they turn it in on time? Is their recording quality? Do they introduce themselves? So you can see I've also given 10 points for that as well. So I wanted to kind of highlight my traditional setup for how I've set up that rubric for that virtual lab. And then as she navigates back to the modules, you'll see module 3 was again moving forward with heat, I think was, yeah, heat and timing. And lastly, with this module, this is our final, they're going to sit, kind of do actual independent cooking here. I want to note that I thought group work was important to include in my asynchronous course. So I am actually going to give this group project assignment where they assess themselves with a peer review, where they pop popcorn together and give feedback. And I give a grade for that. And then the final, of course, is actually them submitting a video of them popping the popcorn and showing me how many burnt kernels so I can assess appropriately. Looking at the rubric, you can see I kind of set everything up the same, where I give points for how they navigate through the assignment, the final product, if there's burnt popcorn or not. I do have a mastery of 10% or less there. And then again, professionalism is important, so I want them to adhere to the instructions. The video needs to be 3 to 5 minutes, and I also have points equated for business casual, and how well they present that video. So when my program decided we are going to go at a program level to change our whole track to CBE, but this course just itself was going to be redesigned. I knew that when I was partnered with Ann, it was going to be an easy task. This is a flexible online course. I think I can just reorder a couple of things. The rubric probably will be able to be reused because I am assessing for some skill-based things. So when Ann and I entered that conversation, I thought, well, this will be pretty easy redesign. So now Ann's going to navigate us through, as the instructional designer, kind of how she helped me redesign this course on the CBE level, keeping in mind we've merged numerous conversations and courses. So to design this process.
Yeah, so here I have a course progression different than a course map. So even in a CBE course or a CBE development, you're still going to go through the backwards design process and have a set course map that is aligned to the objectives and the program level objectives and the competencies. But just for the purpose of this example, we have a progression. So right away, you'll see module 1. We're not starting with the history of microwave popcorn anymore. Mary thought that was really important for her asynchronous course for students to have that background content knowledge. The CBE version, we really want to pay attention to the skills. That's what we're focusing on with our competencies. So students will need that background knowledge of the history of popcorn, history of microwave popcorn, but that's not something that we're going to be assessing in module 1. We're jumping
And
straight
so,
to, go ahead.
sorry, Ann, I didn't mean to cut you off. I
No,
was going
go
to say,
ahead.
so Ann, when she helped me design this, she asked, okay, we got to focus on what's day 1 on the job look like for your students. And that doesn't necessarily equal recall of history of popcorn. So what that might look like in practice is maybe I have a module 0 where it's nice to know info put in there, and the history of information or the history of popcorn's there as supplemental material. But like Ann said, it won't be a module and we're not going to assess for it now. So even though I kind of wanted to keep it, our conversation led me to believe, oh, that can be nice to know instead of have to know and demonstrate for the CBE.
So we're starting with microwave safety. The first thing students are going to do is they're going to take a safety quiz. This is a scenario-based multiple choice quiz. That's just what we decided would work best for this course and these students. That's our way to assess what knowledge they're bringing in, and then offer that support based on those results. So we have the first level of support, some supplemental activities here. Some of these might be the same as our asynchronous course. Some of them might be a little bit different. And then we have a second level if students need a little bit more targeted support along with instructor feedback, they would receive that as well. Depending on the course, we could have maybe had a little bit more information about the history of microwave popcorn in one of these tiered supports, if that's something that kind of played into the safety. That didn't really apply to this course, but just something to keep in mind. Just because we're not assessing for it, the content and the background knowledge might be something that students need in order to be successful when executing those skills. So based on how well students do on the safety quiz, we have a threshold for mastery. They'll either receive their targeted support or move on to our final assessment, where we're really assessing that competency. So they have a chance to practice their skills, they have a chance to receive feedback, they have a chance to receive additional targeted support before they are assessed on that competency.
And so that conversation to get to there, what led me and Ann to design this flow, or Ann and I to design this flow, was she first said, what do they need to do day one on the job? What does that look like? And our program decided that. So program outcomes and competencies, program level learning outcomes were designed. And then our next question she asked me was like, okay, how can we break that into bite-sized pieces and organize your course to make that happen? So then that led to student learning outcomes, which then led to, well, what does mastery look like? And then how are they gonna get to that mastery? And so this flow is us, how we've both decided how are we going to get to that final assessment? What does that look like for our students?
So same thing here with module two. Now we're looking at cooking microwave popcorn, depending on how well students do with our analysis here, which is what we've decided is the best way to assess the knowledge they're bringing in. There are some things that all students will need to do. So even if they do really well and they demonstrate mastery on our first assessment, we still want them to be able to analyze popcorn cooking instructions before they have a chance to do that final assessment to really demonstrate that competency. And then again, based on how well they do with our initial analysis, they'll receive that targeted support and targeted feedback based on their current knowledge and skills in order to build what they need. And everyone arrives at that same end goal of mastering that competency. So we'll go back to the modules page here. As I'm scrolling down to where we have our CBE course set up, you'll notice it is a little bit different. Mary mentioned before that we are using the mastery pathways, which is just one option for setting up a CBE course. But I'll show you in student view what this looks like. Students only have access to the assessments, the assignments, the materials that they need in order to support them with that competency. They don't see everything like they would in a traditional course. So we have the layout here for module one, and then we have module two here with our additional support. And we chose to set this up. Pathway students don't see this part of it, but we have just things everybody needs to do, additional support based on their first assessment, and then even more support if they need that an additional level of targeted support. But again, this can take different forms depending on what works best for your course and your competency.
So if you decide to go with the mastery paths, you can see there how, and scroll back down to that module view.
Yep.
Sorry, I was going to say one thing.
No, you're good.
You can see beside the initial assessment there, competency one. So we've designed something that mimics the knowledge from and the skills from that final assessment. And again, program level decided what mastery looks like and what the threshold is. So if you notice, that initial assessment is what's going to trigger one of three things for students to see. So then Ann's helped me decide, like, they'll see that task list if they score 10 to 7 points on that initial assessment and so forth. And that's getting into the weeds a little bit, but just so when you're looking at that, you can see the way we've chosen to use mastery paths, that initial assessment will trigger that score, will trigger what particular items students see. And again, Ann's decided the supports alongside me of what they might need along the way. So when you see those things to the right that have numbers and kind of branches, that's Canvas, our behind the scenes setup to make that work for targeted versions. And I think you were going to show them the student view now. I kind of interrupted you there, sorry. But I just wanted to let you know that little bit of numbers and language, that's Canvas organization behind the scenes to make that all work well with that initial setup.
So in a traditional course, students see everything. Here in my CBE, students I can't do anything until I complete this first initial assessment. So that's my way as the instructor of evaluating what content knowledge my students are bringing in. And then based on that, I'll be able to provide them the support that they need.
And Anne, I just want to jump in real quick because this really speaks to part of the conversation we had last time about some of those adult learners that may have a lot of background knowledge already or have experience in a particular area. As Anne and Mary mentioned, this is not a requirement in terms of Mastery Pass. If a faculty chose that they wanted to give them all the content, absolutely, that's certainly a way to do that. This Mastery Path option allows for differentiation of instruction for some of those adult learners who may have, I would say significant background knowledge that may not need all the detail that a student with less knowledge has. That's where those Mastery Paths really become powerful. And then as you see there, that grade book will adjust for that individual student based on the path that they're in. And maybe you are going to get to that, and I didn't want to jump ahead, but wanted to point that out as well.
No, all good things. Yeah.
I was just going to trigger the pathway to give a quick visual just to show that students will be able to see only what is assigned to them once they complete that first assessment. Our rubrics, we also took some time to redesign the rubrics when it comes to the CBE course. On our final assessment, we're looking at that first competency. And in this rubric here, I have a threshold for mastery. So we've decided that mastery equals 18 out of 25 points for this competency. But on this one, I also have an option to exceeds mastery. Again, that does not have to be the way that it is set up for this competency, especially when Mary and I were having that conversation of what does mastery look like. And this would be something that would be consistent throughout the whole program. We wanted to make sure that students not only could demonstrate mastery, but depending on their skills, they might have the option to go beyond mastery.
And Anne really talked about the value and the importance of a strong rubric to me in this CBE course, and how, especially with that feedback loop. I think in another session, somebody had mentioned the workload for instructors. And while, yes, it's a high level of engagement because you're giving that individualized, intentional feedback, having a really strong, well-designed rubric is so valuable in a CBE course, so that when you're giving that intentional feedback, that mastery language is students recognize it, you're using it consistently, and that can make that workload not necessarily just a click of the button, but it can kind of help streamline that feedback a little bit as you are trying to give individualized feedback. So you can focus more on the learning piece instead of just writing endless comments to students if you have a very well-designed thoughtful rubric. So I wanted to highlight that here. As you can see, it looks different, significantly different than my virtual lab rubric from my synchronous course.
And even with this first assessment here, I'm assessing the student's skills. So this is kind of the way that we've decided to break down that first competency to make sure that we're looking at the skills students are demonstrating. I don't have points for things like their professional attire. That could be part of the competency depending on the course and the assessment. It wasn't what I was assessing here. So everything is just tied back to that competency to make sure that my students are able to they've mastered the skill I'm trying to teach. And I'm going to go down to our second module for our CBE version of this course. And again, you'll see there's additional support, additional assignments and assessments for students to do, in addition to receiving that targeted instruction, or I'm sorry, that targeted feedback from their instructor. This rubric here for our final assessment for competency 2, this one just has a mastery threshold. So again, it doesn't always, your rubric doesn't necessarily always have to have a mastery threshold and an exceeds mastery threshold, just another option. But it should be assessing the skills that students are learning throughout that module. Anything else we need to point out here, Mary?
If you want to just show the visual of the mastery gradebook, we didn't set it up to use, but if you just want to show the color coding piece, that's a nice visual. You can, again, there's no 100% way to set it up in the CBE course, but if you use the mastery gradebook, this is what that looks like. It'll be color coded. And if you see there at the end, we have the one competency, the program level learning outcome here, where students can pop a bag of popcorn safely and independently. That's what we're assessing for throughout this whole course. And I may have grades attached to other sub-level competencies, module level student learning outcomes, but really that's the program level one that we're assessing for. So depending on how I use my rubrics, depending on how I chose to set up my grading, and again, there's a ton of different ways we could choose to do that from a program or course level, but this would be color coded and a nice visual learning for students too. And so if depending on how we set that up, it would be triggered here to be a nice color coded chart for students. You also have the decision on how you want those grades to kind of work. We chose to do a weighted average on that one learning. So that means I might give them feedback on this particular competency throughout the whole course, but that final time that they do it is weighted so that they're not punished for the beginning of the course, maybe trying to acquire the skill, and they're rewarded for really being engaged and putting their best effort as they progress through the course. So those are also conversations we had with faculty throughout this past year. A lot of how do you want grading to look? Do you want to honor their highest attempt on this activity? Do you want to honor a weighted average, a decaying average? Just there's a lot of different options for how to approach that. And so again, that's a little bit in the weeds, but just showing you those are very intentional conversations you can have as you're redesigning your course, going from asynchronous to CBE. So when I initially approached that and said, oh, this might be a really easy flip of a couple of activities. Surely Anne can just, flip-flop some things for me and we'll be good to go. If you just kind of do that scroll from the student or the instructor view here, if you look at my module 1 and 2 in my asynchronous, that looks very significantly different than the CBE version when we chose to do the mastery paths for this particular example. And so that was kind of the last little thing I thought we might want to show them, is just that visual if they choose to use that gradebook view as part of that conversation.
And you'll notice there is some overlap between the assignments and materials from our asynchronous course to our CBE course, because of course it's still the same course, the content, all of that kind of stuff, but the way that students are approaching it is different. The way that they're graded is different. The way that they progress through the course is different. So there is overlap because, again, same course, same content, but a different modality, so it's a different delivery. All right, I'll stop sharing my screen again. We'll go back to those slides.
Sure. Let me grab my screen that I wanted to share. And so we'll just kind of quickly recap that thought process and those questions that Anne would ask me as a faculty for us to kind of get to that end result. And then of course we want to leave time for some questions here at the end. And so, like we mentioned, the conversation would start off with day 1 on the job. What do they need to do? They've walked across that stage, first day of employment, and that's really going to center those program level learning outcomes. And again, with CBE, that's where we start. We start at that end result. So we start at graduation, and we're going to work our way backwards. And so that's the program level focus. So Anne had those conversations with me. We put that in the outcomes of the course, put that on the flow chart or the flow map. Again, it'll be a course map, but that might look different depending on how you set that up. Anything there, Anne, you want to add?
No, I don't think
Okay.
so.
Okay.
Oh, there is something I wanted to add. And just piggybacking off of what Mary said about the program level, starting at that very zoomed out approach to make sure that students are supported consistently, everything is consistently aligned, and students are supported when and where and how they need it. And it's also not going to be a repeat of like the course learning goals. Remember, it's all going to be skill based. So that knowledge is going to be important. The things that students need to know in that course are going to be important. They have to have that knowledge in order to be successful in the skills, but the skills are really where we're focusing on.
Absolutely. And I'm looking at our time. So to leave time for questions, you will have this slide deck. So these questions that kind of orient the process of how to get to that end result you'll have. But for time's sake, I'm going to just kind of show them to you, mention them, and then we might zip through it, if you will. And so again, program level learning outcomes. Then we move into course level student learning outcomes. And again, competency being the language that we're doing that. So how do we take that big and bite size it? Then the next conversation would be defining mastery at the program level and then zooming into the course level modules, what that would look like, and how are we going to use the gradebook and Canvas to set that up? How are we going to orient the gradebook? And then zooming into those paths. Doesn't have to be mastery paths, but how's the flow going to look for that course? You're going to then highlight module student learning outcomes, then your assessments, your final and initial, and then what's the middle look like? What are the learning materials and activities to get there? How can and will a student achieve mastery in this course? And then Anne made this really nice graphic here that I think really highlights the loop of learning, the feedback loop, and it's very intentional, it's thoughtful. And so what's the path for students who haven't mastered it yet? Again, focusing on that growth mindset, not yet. And so this is just kind of recapping that process. We anchored the thoughts in those 5 questions for how we got there, and we tried to think of all the different conversations from the past year and the different case studies of all the different faculty that partnered with us to, how did we get to those end results? What did that look like? That messy creative process to design those courses. And so this kind of just recaps that for you as well. So I will try to get through that, but I'll pass it to Matt to kind of let us